In this portion of the video, we'll talk about what is pH, what is buffer pH, how limestone works, what is CCE, and what is ECCE. One of the biggest fertility questions is soil pH. And why is soil pH important? What do I need to do to change that? And soil pH is vitally important. This chart is for Midwest Labs, and it's showing that at a 6.8 pH, you get 100% of your genetic potential of your seed. Going to a 5.7 pH knocks 17% of your top-end yield off even before you put the corn in the ground. What's interesting is many universities will say a 5.8 pH is adequate. So if 17% of your top-end yield not being there before it's even planted is adequate to you, then pH may not be important. But we think many farmers will find 17% yield increase vitally important. pH is important to look at because it affects everything. When looking at soybeans, pH has a huge effect on nodulation. Having a 6.5 pH, which is pretty where we'd like to see pH, between a 6.4 and 6.8, will give you 77 nodules per plant. Going to a 5.0 pH, which many Midwestern soils can be, you lose over 30% of your nodulation. And the problem with that is in soybeans, your nodules make all your nitrogen. And when you're growing soybeans, you're growing a protein crop. It takes nitrogen to make proteins. If you don't have nodulation, you're not making protein, you're not making yield. So having that pH in that neutral range is going to allow our soybean plants to make all the nitrogen we need for high yielding crops. The other big effect pH has is on nutrient availability. At a 6.0 pH, 25% of your phosphorus is unavailable to your plants. You can put out your fertilizer, but the plant can't access it. With nitrogen, you can be losing up to 11%. Throw some numbers at that. The cost of not liming a 6.0 pH with a yield bushel goal with a 200 bushel yield goal, if you put out 140 pounds of nitrogen at 60 cents a pound, 24% is unavailable, you've just spent $20 that will never make you more money. When you add in your phosphates, if you put out 70 pounds of phosphates and 48% is unavailable, that's $16 in wasted inputs that won't make you any more money. So that's almost $40 in inputs, money we've spent to make more money, make more yield, that is just lost. It's unavailable to the plant, and it doesn't return us more. If you figure in that yield loss potential of 34 bushels, which is 17% of a 200 bushel crop, at $5 per bushel, that's costing you $170 in lost yield just from having a 6.0 pH. So the cost of having an acid soil is at least $200 per acre. That's the potential loss from low pH. Notice we didn't talk anything about potassium or other nutrients. pH has an effect on those, so it could be much greater than that. Here's a good visual for you. One of the reasons we get so much better crop nutrient uptake is at a neutral pH, we get much greater root growth. The more roots you have, the more soil you're going to interact with, the more nutrients that plant's going to uptake, and the more bushels you're going to make. University of Wisconsin has done studies, and they've seen that as you bring your pH into a neutral range, you can see a 10% to a 40% yield increase. We've seen that on many of our strip trials. Many of our agronomists in their strip trials have seen that. So we've talked about the importance of pH, but what is pH? pH is only a measure of hydrogen. It's a measure of the hydrogen ion, and in acidic soils we're measuring the H hydrogen plus ion. For alkaline soils we're measuring a hydroxide ion. Very shortly after what is pH, many people ask on my soil report, what's buffer pH? Buffer pH can be known as the reserve acidity. And a good visual on that is these coffee pots that represent clay soils and sandy soils. A clay soil is going to have a higher buffer capacity. It's going to hold more nutrients than a sandy soil. The sandy soil will hold less nutrients and therefore has a lower buffer capacity. So if you have your big pot and you take out 1 cup out of the big pot and 1 cup out of the small pot, the level of the coffee in the big pot will drop less than the small pot. So that's why when you're looking through your soil samples, your soil tests, and you see one field has a 5.5 pH but needs 2 tons of lime to change the pH, and the second field has a 5.5 pH but needs 4 tons of lime to change the pH. That's because of that buffer capacity and the buffer pH. So how do soils get acidic? Nitrogen is the #1 source. All nitrogens contain hydrogen. Some nitrogens contain more than other. Ammonium sulfate actually has nitrogen in it and is a very acid-forming fertilizer. Other ways that soils can become acid is rainfall. Rainfall is very pure and will naturally leach out our cationic nutrients, which many times contain hydroxide ions. Decaying organic matter will also cause acidity. But our #1 source, again, is nitrogen. So if we're applying nitrogen, we need to be applying limestone to adjust that pH. One of the quality measurements for lime products is calcium carbonate equivalent. And different sources of lime materials have different calcium carbonate equivalents. One of the components of calcium carbonate equivalent is moisture. And how much moisture is in that product can make it more or less effective. Many times with ag lime, it's made all summer, piled out in a quarry or out in a field, and gets rained on. There's no way to tell how much moisture is in that product you're spreading, so you never really know that you got enough lime on until a year later when you've sampled it or harvested your crop and found out your soil's still acidic and you didn't get as much bushels as you thought. Here's a representation of a soil molecule, and a soil particle is going to hold the 5 main cationic nutrients, which is magnesium, calcium, hydrogen, potassium, and sodium. A clay particle will hold more nutrients than a sandy particle. So again, on a clay soil, we may need to do more lime than what we would need to do on a sandy soil. As you grow your crop, that crop's going to remove cationic nutrients off the soil particle. In our fertilizer program, if we're only putting back nitrogen, we're only putting back hydrogen ions, and we drive that soil pH down quickly. We need to be replacing the potassium and the calcium that we're pulling off the soil particle. How limestone actually works is we have a soil particle with hydrogen ions attached to it. We apply lime, which is calcium carbonate, is a scientific name for it. The carbonate molecule is actually what interacts with the hydrogen. And the carbonate molecule splits up and makes water and carbon dioxide, and the calcium's just left there behind. And that's what attaches back to the soil particle. The calcium does not do the lime work for you. It's the carbonate molecule. Many people think, well, if I have lots of calcium, my pH is okay. Again, pH has nothing to do with calcium. It is just a measure of hydrogen in the soil. So we can have soils that are low pH and low calcium, or we can have high pH soils with low calcium. We're just measuring the hydrogen ion with pH.